Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. It's great to see all of you here this evening. I've met many of you. I see some familiar faces in the audience, but those who I haven't, I'm Kim Darroch, British Ambassador in Washington. And thank you for coming to this inaugural Global Thinkers debate. This event is down to the Institute for Government, to its director, Bronwen Maddox, and to Legal in General for bringing us all together. Bronwen is going to speak in a moment and will introduce the panellists, but I just want to say just a couple of words about my own experience of the main players on the stage here tonight, because I think we have a real treat in store. And I'll start with the Institute of Government, whose initiative the event is. For those of you who don't know about the Institute, it's been around since 2008. It's completely independent, has the purpose of making government more effective. And let me tell you, they really do challenge how the British government does its work. As a career civil servant or diplomat for the last 40 years, I would love to say that it's hard to imagine how we could be more effective than we are. But of course, I know the truth, which is there are so many ways in which we can improve. My personal experience of the Institute dates from my time as National Security Advisor from 2012 to 2016. We only created that post in the UK in 2010, so I was the second incumbent. And to be honest with you all, we were kind of still making it up as we went along and deciding what the right structures should be. So I confess the idea that the Institute of Government would do an analysis and a report on us was a little threatening. How much would they discover that we really hadn't made up very well? But in actual fact, it was an exceptionally fair and thoughtful and valuable report which characterises the work of the Institute. Bronwen herself, I remember from earlier in my career when I was the Foreign Office press spokesman, and she was foreign editor of The Times. I have to admit that when my assistant said the words, "Bronwen is on the telephone for you," it would strike fear into my heart because she was so well informed. You just knew she was going to ask some killer questions. So maybe we'll see some of that tonight. The panellists should be on their guard. A few other comments. John Godfrey, Legal in General now, was in number 10 when I actually started here in the early years of the Theresa May government. So as experienced government right from the centre, and dare I say it, in a crisis atmosphere pretty much throughout, I guess. I first met Anne-Marie Slaughter back in 2010 when I was ambassador to the European Union, and she was visiting Brussels in her capacity as Director of Policy Planning in Hillary Clinton's State Department. Anne-Marie and her husband came to dinner at my house, and as you all know, she had a brilliant career then in State Department and has done many brilliant things since. As for Paul Tucker, he had an extraordinary career in central banking, rising to the number 2 slot in the Bank of England, and was a pivotal figure in Europe in coping with the 2008 financial crisis. But I think of Paul most of all as one of the most entertaining drink or dinner companions you could possibly have. As for tonight, you will know there are some really big subjects to be discussed, from the economic challenges facing our two countries to implications of improving productivity and technological advancement against the backdrop of an ever-aging population. But you're all global thinkers here, so we expect insight, wisdom, wit and brilliance. No pressure. So this should be great. Thank you all for coming, and over to Bronwen. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, not all of which I knew was coming. We are delighted to be here from the Institute for Government and working with Legal in General on this. We planned this some months ago. We knew it would be lively times. We didn't know quite this lively in either the US or the UK. It's been part of the unexpected pleasure of this week to go into conversation after conversation and have just as an opening gambit whether it is better to have a government that is facing a vote it may lose on Tuesday or face one that is shut down completely. to be debated. I'm delighted to have this terrific panel here. Paul Tucker, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, and now at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, and author of the recently published Unelected Power, pointing out that much power went to technocrats like yourself in recent years, and that this can be difficult to accommodate within democracies. Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter, I've had the pleasure of being on panels with before, obviously now at running New America, but before that, Dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and formerly of the State Department as well, and John Godfrey, as Kim Darroch was saying, long career advising in many continents in the city, with a sojourn in the very heart of British government as well. Let me just say a tiny bit about why we're doing this. We do indeed look at the nuts and bolts of government, not just the UK, but many other countries. We look at questions like how governments take decisions, whether they're based on evidence or not. We look at the professional skills of professional civil servants and politicians. We try and help them improve those skills. We look at whether they're accountable to the public and whether more can be done on those kind of things. But we want to do it in the context of the things that make it a hard time to run a country. And so we're delighted to be paired up with Legal and General for this, to take a step back and look at some of the factors at the moment that are making it a particularly hard time to run the two countries we're really talking about tonight. We have framed this as economic challenges facing modern government, but it's going to take us immediately into the political questions, and really the question of whether politics in our countries and whether our democracies can solve those problems. So with that, Paul's going to kick off and talk about 10 minutes, and the other two are going to chip in and counter immediately after. I'm going to fire a few questions at them, but I'm looking forward to lots of questions from you. Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, thank you, Bronwen, and thank you, Ambassador. It's really great to be here. For most of our adult lives, probably most of our biological lives, three great spheres of public policy have lived relatively happily in parallel worlds: the world of security policy and foreign policy, the world of trade policy, and the world that I belong to, the world of international macroeconomic and financial policy. They're not hermetically sealed. Economic and financial sanctions connect them up a bit, but basically parallel worlds. It's a world in which technocrats can thrive and where elected politicians can retreat. And if it goes on for long enough, there's a certain hollowing out of both the capability of elected governments and expectations of elected governments, and actually their own sense of who they are. And yet, for some years, it's been obvious that we're re-entering one of those periods when these worlds will converge. The things that I'm most familiar with, it really isn't very frequent that the design of the international monetary system connects with geopolitics. It certainly did in the end of the Second World War, when Bretton Woods was being constructed. It certainly did in the early 1970s when Bretton Woods was falling apart. We're very obviously, it seems to me, entering a period when sooner or later these worlds will come together again. It would be most unusual for a rising geopolitical power not to be interested in issuing a very significant reserve currency and to position themselves accordingly. The last time that happened, when essentially the dollar succeeded sterling, this was handing the baton between allies, and actually it was a desperately uncomfortable period all around the world. The challenges that we face in economic policy and political policy are made more difficult by the fact that China and India and Brazil are completely integrated into the world economy, and yet actually potentially stand in a different place in terms of foreign policy and security policy and the structure and balance of power in the international order. So it's quite different from the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was basically the enemy everywhere, and there's a little funnel partly through London where the Soviet bloc held their dollars. This is much more complicated than that. And so first thing I want to say is that is not a set of problems that my tribe can cure. because the resolution of problems like that or challenges like that is about values as well as about techie stuff. It's also hugely distant from the kinds of things that the general public have been used to our countries facing. And yet, all this is happening at a point where very obviously the entry of billions of people into the world labor markets and shifts in technology are having a rather profound effect on expectations of family living standards, children's and grandchildren's living standards in the Western world. The most important thing, I don't know how to get this right, the most important thing in those circumstances is not to make big mistakes. And most of all, perhaps, not to make big mistakes in both the maintenance of the international order and the design of international institutions. And so I'm no trade expert whatsoever, but what strikes me about the debates going on about trade at the moment is that the people that liberalized trade and set up the WTO kind of half a generation or a generation ago, they didn't anticipate some of the challenges that are faced now. That, yes, having a dispute settlement system with quasi-judges would give rigor and discipline to the process and avoid some of the vetoes that existed in the past, but would also lead to, quote, judges making public policy in ways that might be alienating to policymakers and the populations behind them. In the world that I'm most familiar with, the expectations of what central bankers can do is completely out of whack with reality. I will make a few assertions which I believe to be incontrovertibly true. Central bankers cannot make economies more dynamic. They cannot shift the trend rate of productivity growth. They cannot create more wealth in societies in 10 or 15 years' time. They can do all sorts of other things. I mean, as Mario Draghi did rather miraculously. You can buy time for government. You can buy quite a lot of time, actually, for governments to do the big things that only governments can do. And yet the paradox here is because central banks can buy time and because they've become so credible and authoritative, it has become convenient for elected governments to stand back and let central bankers and monetary policy makers take the whole burden, which has created distortions in financial markets, which some people have bothered about, but more importantly has probably contributed somewhat to skewing accretions in wealth and standards of living over the past few years. And so now there's a debate about what the Federal Reserve should do or what the ECB should do, as though actually the solutions to all of our problems will hang on that over the next 2 to 3 years. And actually it's just not remotely true. The great thing about monetary policy, and then I'll close there, is you get about 8 goes a year. If you make a mistake, no one ever says this, but it's absolutely true. If you make a mistake in regulatory policy or in fiscal policy or something, and then you have a kind of go for a long walk and you think, damn, we shouldn't have done that. It's too late. You've been through, in regulation in this country, through 3 years of notice and comment rulemaking consultation, or in fiscal policy, forging your alliance in Congress or the European Parliament. You're cooked. With monetary policy, you make a mistake, the taper tantrum, well, you just get another go in 6 weeks' time. And you know, people shout, and Wall Street and the City of London shout. And so what the third thing I want to say is don't expect the solutions to the challenges that we face in the United States or the UK or continental Europe to come from my tribe. They can do what they can do, but they can't do the big things, thank God.
Paul, thanks very much indeed for that opening. And let me just pick up on one thing before moving on to Anne-Marie. You called your book Unelected Power. Do you think the unelected nature of technocrats such as yourself running central banks has contributed to the kind of political problems and mistrust of politics that we've got at the moment?
Yeah, a bit. I do a bit. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I think the marvel of representative democracy is that it separates how we feel about the system of government from how we feel about the government of the day. And the only thing I know for sure about government is that eventually it messes up, and sometimes horribly in every field, and sometimes in ways that can that can really hurt the people. And it's terrible. The financial crisis is an example. And yet, the way we think about that in a representative democracy was vote them out. They let us down. But you couldn't vote me out. You can't vote Jay out. You can't vote out the judges, which is a good thing. And so if we depend too much on people who are unelected, when they inevitably fail, when we inevitably failed, there is a risk that people feel, my God, I can't even get rid of these people. And the greatest worry I have is that in slow motion, this is a slow motion thing, in slow motion people start to become slightly alienated, somewhat alienated from the system of government. And yet actually I think that the best thing we've got going for us is the flexibility of democracy, which I think is the great triumph of the Western world.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, your
Long may it remain the great triumph. It's been bumpy. So I started my career as an academic in 1990, and the heady days of 1990, 1991, obviously the wall coming down in 89, German reunification, 1992, the single market, at the end of history, liberal democracy ascendant, triumphant. And I started studying relationships among liberal states because it was interesting, again, if you looked at the EU, which was rising, the United States, Japan, and the communist world had ended. And I studied relationships among liberal states and quickly realized that actually what was most interesting about those relationships were the networks among the unelected officials. The network, I mean, indeed, Paul was at the Bank of International Settlements. That's really where I started. A network of central bankers that was hugely powerful, but not very well known. And then I looked to networks of securities commissioners, of insurance regulators, all of those now, a whole institution called the Joint Forum. But then networks of environmental regulators, attorneys general. Wherever you looked among liberal democracies, you had a growing web of relationships among these unelected officials. And then judges. And at those days, many of you in Washington will remember the fierce Supreme Court fights over whether or not the U.S. Supreme Court should even cite another court. Meantime, other courts around the world were busy appropriating large amounts of English and Canadian and Australian law. That's all 1994. Fast forward to 2004. I had a couple kids along the way, but I finally managed to write a book on this subject called The New World Order, and I gave book talks. And I was very excited because as a former international lawyer, this looked to me like international law that could actually be enforced. And but it wasn't through a treaty, it was national law, so the central bankers of one country, the central bankers of another, the judges of one, the judges of another, who were reaching consensus, and then it was up to each of them to implement it. And I thought, well, when you come to implement it, you have various checks and balances. My audience did not quite see this the same way. Many of the people I spoke to, and I was still a professor, basically said to me, you are describing my worst nightmare. A world run by the unelected, a world run by financial regulators, central bankers, and judges. So that was 2004. That view is now ascendant. And indeed, as Paul says, it's not simply, there is definitely something in that, right? I mean, and Paul's book really talks about a framework for legitimacy that, of course, the central bankers and the other regulators not only got along better with each other than the other parts of their government, but they could also occasionally reach agreement and then go back to bureaucratic politics and say, well, the British are going to do this, the French are going to do this, we have to do this too. So there is a question of unelected power. But beyond the reality, there is, of course, the irresistible temptation on the part of elected officials to blame those unelected officials. And then as things don't go well, to point the voters to that unelected power. So it's not the only reason we are having the populist moment we are having, but it is part of it. But I want to contrast that with the way Paul talked about the ascending powers. So if that's the economics, the regulatory framework, the judicial framework, but then if you look at geopolitics as a whole, and it's heavily political, we're at a moment, of course, of rising powers and settling powers. I often talk about them as returning powers, since the Chinese had a larger economy than all the rest of us put together for most of human history. We're newcomers. But what's so interesting is the dangers of those countries. China for sure, Brazil and India less so, but neither are immune from this, are precisely that those islands of unelected power are not secure, right? Precisely because you cannot trust a Chinese judge necessarily. You cannot trust the central bank necessarily. Again, they're more independent. Certainly the judges in India are very independent. But so you have these powers that are rising politically, but economically, the risk is precisely that those institutions that are under attack in our world are not strong enough there. So I think it's an interesting intersection of the two problems. I want to close, though, by offering actually a thesis for a partial solution, because we do need these unelected powers. We absolutely do. And honestly, right now in the United States, the judges, the central bank, many of the regulators who are insisting on following the rule of law as they know it, I'm very glad to see them. Our elected institutions are not covering themselves with glory. But when you take that to the global frame, again, I see the worry that you don't, I mean, I described it as a new world order. I didn't say it was a perfect world order. I said it was a functional one. But I think the only way we are actually going to address these bigger problems of unelected power is not to knock down the judges or the central bankers or the other regulators. It's to increase the networks of non-governmental organizations, of universities, of all the civil society institutions that actually do check governments, not just through elections, but through the existence of civil society. You need to elevate and strengthen global civil society in a way that can hold these networks of different regulators or judges to account. So I will leave it there.
Anne-Marie, thank you, and thank you for people don't always get this early in a discussion to offering solutions. Thank you. Let me ask you one question, though, just about this vision of the New World Order and how it has survived these 15 years. Part of it was a sense that nation states and the very sort of strong sense of nation states might dwindle a bit. Do you think the rise of populism is actually a rebuttal of that?
Yes, so and that's a very important point. There were all these articles in the late 1990s on the new medievalism. And the new medievalism was the withering away of the state. We were going to return to the church and to the academy and to the cities and city-states, some of which you see a little of. That is not true. I think it is, I think the state has proven to be much stronger and, in my view, stays very resilient. But I see these two things as going side by side, because one of the reasons these networks of regulators and judges worked were that the formal international institutions couldn't make room for these new powers, right? We have talked about Security Council reform. I was an early believer that it might happen. I am no longer a believer that it is ever going to happen. And so then the only way you can do it are things like the G20, which was originally the finance ministers, or these other networks. So they proved quite flexible to allow other states to rise. Just as in the EU, becoming a member of the EU is to be able to send your ministers to meet with all the other ministers, ditto the judges, as well as elected officials. So again, I actually think the state is strong, with the global networks, this network of global governance that is composed of domestic officials meeting with each other is there to stay. We have to figure out how to democratize it. And it's not going to be through the United Nations.
Thank you. John, you've got a view from both the finance and very recently in politics as well. on these kind of problems and of the economic challenges that we're facing, which have come through both these conversations. And I'm going to pick up on some of those economic points in a sec. But what is your take on this?
I mean, I guess one of the important questions is, how does business respond to the changes that are afoot, and the situation that we're seeing is quite complex and a difficult set of global changes going on. The tribe that Paul mentioned that he belongs to, the networks that Anne-Marie described, these are all things that used to be known as the establishment. And I think the question for business is, are we subject to the same challenges around legitimacy, around trust? And this is for big business. Are we equally vulnerable to populism? And frankly, I suspect we are, because the survey data does indicate that there is a lack of trust with big business and with the capitalist system and with the experts and so on who run it and who are not, frankly, democratically accountable. So that I think is a challenge. The truth is that big business is pretty comfortable with technocrats and less comfortable with elected politicians. If you think about markets and central bankers, it's a little bit like that old song, the boys watch the girls, watch the boys, watch the girls, and so on. Central bankers are watching markets, markets are watching central bankers, the central bankers are watching the markets back, and so on. And there is a sort of implicit cooperation, if you like, to limit volatility. And it often works very well, especially as Paul says, because the central bankers, if they take a misstep, can correct it very quickly. This doesn't apply to the elected part of government. And the problem with the elected part of government from a business perspective is that it's very easy for them to turbocharge volatility and to upset what happens in the normal run of markets sort of ebbing and flowing. And if we think about the current situation, part of this, of course, is post the 08-09 crash, and the recovery that was put in place after that, driven by QE, which was absolutely the right medicine at the time, but had big side effects. The side effects that were the biggest were the growth in asset prices with a distributional impact. It was a great time to make your living from assets, a difficult time to make your living if you were earning a wage, because real median wages were remarkably stubborn to move, and this was meat and drink to the populists. I suspect part of the problem. It's created a level of exclusive wealth which fuels some of this distrust we've been talking about. And I think part of the response from business is to adopt the opposite of exclusive wealth, which is to move towards a form of more inclusive capitalism. And you can have an equal emphasis, by the way, on the word inclusive and the word capitalism in that mix, because there is not an absolutely necessary trade-off between doing well and doing good. The two can run happily together. Just as a nostalgic exercise on the way over here, I watched Wall Street on the aeroplane. And boy, is that a dated movie now. First of all, because the amounts of money involved are so small. The size of Gordon Gekko's suspenders, as you call them here, was so large. And because none of the financial titans of today would actually go about delivering a greed is good speech. If you look at those who are financial titans today, Larry Fink at BlackRock with $6 trillion under management, talks about environmental, social, and governance responsibility. We run our business the same way with our $1.5 trillion under management. There's a sense of purpose in these businesses, which there wasn't, at the time of Wall Street. So where does that sort of leave us today, and how does this play into some of these issues? Well, there's never been, frankly, so much money in the world as there is today post-QE, rushing around looking for somewhere to earn a return. And it's never been so badly invested. You have at least $10 trillion around the world, which earns less than zero from government bonds. Now, that cannot be, a rational place to put that money. At the same time, you have in the UK, the US particularly, actually, but also the EU, huge infrastructure investment deficits. We have a crumbling physical and digital, the digital infrastructure is not crumbling, but it could be an awful lot better. So there's a huge amount to be done on infrastructure. The politicians fret about trade deficits. Here it's about the US and China. Our micro version is about the UK and the EU. But the long-term challenges are much broader than that. They include the aging demographic. The average Japanese person before very long is going to live to 103. There's a pandemic of dementia which accompanies that. What are we going to do about that? There's the growth of China. And one snippet from nowhere near my business, the growth in air travel by middle-class Chinese people over the next 20 years, according to Boeing, is going to require another 500,000 airline pilots. Where are they going to come from? These are the kind of scale of problems we need to think about. And you then have the issue of technological change. Hugely exciting stuff going on in technology, never been more exciting than it is today. But it's going to create at some time, potentially, a big monopolies challenge, as you look at platform capitalists, which is going to require the sort of innovative and groundbreaking approach that Teddy Roosevelt put into place in the early 1900s. Yeah. This is a massive modern version of that problem. Now, these are all technocrat problems. And the reason I say they're technocrat issues is because they're not susceptible to knee-jerk, quick, get the press release out this afternoon type of policy solutions. They're longer term than the typical political periods of office that are available. And politics is difficult in this regard, as I found in Downing Street, because the urgent always beats the important if you're in that environment. Business can help with this. The key difference between the City of London and Number 10, I found, was that clever policymakers in government are not necessarily very good at execution or delivery of policy, quite the opposite. Business, by contrast, is usually good at delivery but poor at making policy because they're too self-interested. We are too self-interested often. So the shared position is you get very short-term solutions, whether they're driven by opinion poll numbers or whether they're driven by share prices and the need to either pass silly knee-jerk legislation or to do short-termist things like share buybacks, which don't work. Now, the answer, and I'll kind of finish on this, Bronwen, the answer is positive, constructive collaboration to put some of these large capital pools, which are easily identifiable and enormous, to work much more effectively. Where I've seen this really work is less at a national government level and more at a regional or city government level. There are some outstanding people involved in that kind of regional or city level governance. I mean, Mayor Bloomberg in New York was terrific. We've got people in the UK who are great, of all shades of political opinion, Andy Burnham, Andy Street, and so on, to name two. We can do an awful lot with these people because they don't get ideological. They simply want to produce the right solution for where they live. And they are very happy usually to work with big business to get that done. So I think while we shouldn't underestimate the challenges that we face here at the beginning of 2019 at a big top-level government, there is an awful lot of more granular stuff that we can be getting on with doing to meet some of these challenges and use some of this huge amount of money that is flowing around the world. And we can do this with an appropriate sense of inclusive capitalism in a way that therefore meets the concerns not just of the great talkers in the policy world and in the tribe and so on, but which also meets the concerns of the blue-collar voters who are the target market for populists. So that would be my tip.
John, thanks. And you've taken us through a huge range of issues, from people's sense of alienation to the problems of tech regulation, and actually the optimism is in tech, and I'll come back to that at the end. But let me just pick up one of the points. This session is called Economic Challenges for Modern Government, and I wanted to pick up on one and actually ask all three of you about this, one of these problems of whether governments can actually solve this. And this is the point that you touched on of the aging of our societies, and the challenge that it poses to politicians of saying, looking at the challenge of meeting expectations on healthcare and coping with dementia and so on. And they've really got this difficult job of saying to people, we might ask you to work longer. We can't maybe afford your pensions. We may not be able to afford the healthcare that you think you're entitled to. You may have to spend money or equity that's in your house on this kind of thing. All this kind of bargain that you thought you had with your government is being rewritten, not in your favour, now vote for me again. Or they might take the political choice that deficits don't matter for the moment, something that seems more fashionable here than in the UK at the moment. But in terms of political response to this problem that we can see coming and indeed have seen coming for a long time, how do you think governments can work their way through it?
Well, as somebody who was involved in the manifesto for the last election in the UK, which focused quite heavily on the costs of ageing and of health and of social care and of pensions and the need perhaps to trim back some of the universal benefits that old people got. I can tell you when I left government, the Prime Minister was 20 points ahead in the opinion polls. And after the election, it was pretty much even Stevens. And that tells you that older people vote and older people feel very strongly about this bargain, even though they have over the last decade done rather better than working age people in terms of government support. It's really difficult to do. And our approach now at Legal & General as part of the sort of mix of this is to say, look, we're not going to get into this debate about which benefits should be universal or which should be means tested or how this works in old age. Let's solve some of the core problems where we can make a difference. So have we got the right housing stock for older people, for example? Have we got the right investment going into the sort of tech companies that are working on care tech and robotics and devices to help manage long-term diseases of the elderly like diabetes 2 and so on. So there's a lot of practical things we can do. But we have just stepped back from the sort of really complex political and somewhat toxic debate about who should be paying for what in that sense. So just focus on the practical, I think, is the main answer. But these are tough questions.
Yes. And sorry, Anne-Marie, do you want to come in on that? And then I'm going to move
Yeah, so I'm not a techno, I'm certainly no techno-utopian, and I'm probably equally optimistic and pessimistic. It's just like any other technology. The technologies we're looking at have just as many problems as they have advantages. But in this regard, I do think, with respect to aging and with respect to the future of work, the focus needs to be on bringing down the cost, right? There is absolutely no way we can pay for the older people that we are going to have in our societies at the present cost of hiring full-time help, full-time drivers, all the things that you need. But that is where, if you look at Japan, if you look at the technologies that are really in view, whether it's self-driving cars or robots that can make a lot of the work of caring for older people and younger people much easier, right? To do the kind of heavy physical labor and to the kind of physical help, that can be automated. And then there are jobs that you can become much more interesting to have. You can actually create an economy around. So this is the area in which you look at it and you say, absolutely, we can't afford it, but investment in the right technology and enough incentives for developing it, you can see within 10 or 15 years, within exactly the time that I am particularly interested in the development of this technology, that you really can see a very different life for an older person, a much more autonomous life and a cheaper one.
Paul, what's your take on this? On the basically the aging question, but also the kind of things we're touching on and whether governments still have the capacity to raise tax, and indeed, I also wanted to hear your views on the relation between governments and companies and particularly tech companies that John was raising. Yes. So
let me say something about the relationship between business and government, and then something about antitrust. This is a very broad brush proposition that, as I'm going to articulate, it can't be literally true. I think the leaders of many businesses today, particularly international businesses, are much less tuned in to domestic government and domestic politics than I was lucky enough as quite a young man, late 20s, early 30s, to be what Americans would call chief of staff to the governor of the Bank of England, what we call private secretary. I would say that the British business leaders I saw during that period, including the top bankers, were better tuned in to British politics and British government, and the many American bankers I met during that period were better tuned in to American government and American politics than their successors, the people that I dealt with. And that's because if you're managing a global corporation, you can lose interest in actually where you're domiciled. Now, your company is a bit different because of who the chair and you're there and so on. The second thing I'd say is that I'm no expert in social policy, but I'm a citizen, so I think not much matters more. The growth would make it somewhat easier to solve these problems. I think the biggest economic challenge is about low productivity growth. The way you should think about this is a world with zero productivity growth is a zero-sum game. That we are, if America, God help us, this won't happen, but if America had zero productivity growth, and the UK has had very low productivity growth for a decade, then the people in this room would only be better off if everybody outside this room was worse off. And so you can see that the politics of a world of zero productivity growth are really terrible, because there is only distributional policy. There isn't a growing cake. I don't know what I would do. I mean, I do think that one of the great moments of 20th century economic policy was Roosevelt's antitrust policy. And the details are all technocratic, but it's the Roosevelt. Yeah. It's the will behind it. In my field, inflation in the Western world was broken by Paul Volcker, and it's a kind of moment when we should all be thinking about Paul Volcker. And he was able to do what he did, which was transformational because Jimmy Carter empowered him, and then because Congress protected him from some of the attacks from the Reagan government later on. You don't get a bigger figure, literally and metaphorically, than Paul Volcker in my tribe. But if he were here, he'd say, but he couldn't have done it unless there was that backdrop of political support. In Europe, and I mean continental Europe, if I could lift one thing from the US setup and take it there, it would be America's bankruptcy laws. That allowing capital to flow where it can be used best. The bankruptcy laws here are terrific because they reduce but not eliminate the stigma of failure. And companies can kind of be resurrected with equity holders being wiped. I try to devise a system for that to be used for banks. And the point I want to make is we don't even copy each other's best ideas. In Britain, there are lots of British people in the room. Everybody in the room will know the name of the governor of the Bank of England. Many of you will be able to name the previous governor of the Bank of England. I wonder how many of you can name the head of the Competition Authority in London. A thought I had 20 years ago was we can provide a platform of monetary and banking stability, etc. But actually, the workings of the economy are probably more important in terms of what the Competition Authority is doing. And yet and so I would like there to be political will behind a much more robust competition policy, which I think in slow motion would reduce some of the plutocracy and address some of the kind of sense of grievance that people have about winner takes all.
Thanks for that. I've hardly run out of questions, but I suspect there are going to be quite a few here. So let's go to questions from the audience. If we could slightly dim the lights. So
that would be great, actually.
Yes.
The interrogation chamber.
In the full glare of lights. Who would like to kick off as one here?
That as opposing to the unelected elites, and where do you see those two trains running? Are they running in parallel in our two countries, or is there something different about that populism that we see?
Oh, I think it's different. I moved to Harvard at the end of 2013. When I went back to Europe in the summer of 2014, people said, "What's it like?" I said, "Oh, it's 1750." And I said, "But they have no idea just as in Paris, they had no idea that it was coming. This has become an aristocratic society. France is an aristocratic, technocratic society. I don't think that Britain is either of those things. Actually, I think, ironically, Britain is much closer to being a republic than either the United States or France.
Do you want to just spell out what you mean by that?
I think that there are far fewer concentrations of private power in United Kingdom politics and government than is the case in the United States compared with France. Yes, I was part of a tribe, but it is not the same as being an enarch, which is 100 people a year, and they all know where they came. You know, my friends tended to come first, second, or third, because that's how it works there. I think we're in a slightly better position in that respect. And I think part of what we're seeing in the UK is just the workings through of our parliamentary politics and the kind of internal dynamism of the political parties. The difficulty I think that we face is that our system of government, constitutional system of government, is much better at ordinary politics and ordinary government than it is at constitutional politics. I think the American structure is rather better at constitutional politics than it is at ordinary politics and government. And so I think that although it looks as though things are the same, I think the kind of structure of our government processes is profoundly different in ways that will, one way or another, have a big effect over the next, 20 years. I tend to think in blocks of 25 years.
So, we don't know. Yeah, go on, quick response, then I'm going to take some more. Yeah,
so quickly, so I agree on the concentrations of power, and I agree actually that France and the United States are in a different place. And I keep wondering if the Gilets jaunes are not the first intimations of 1789. Nobody knew in 1788 that these protests were going to be the ones that toppled the monarchy. I think it's worth watching. But I think it's not just the concentrations of wealth here, which are extraordinary, and of power. It's that our political system is broken, so that there is no way to translate the normal frustrations into actually a check. We can't get Theodore Roosevelt was a third, he was elected because he succeeded McKinley, but ultimately he was a third party, right? He represented a different group. We cannot get there, and our two parties are here. So I think it's the lack of safety valve as much as anything else.
Yeah, can I comment on that?
Yeah, quick, and John, do you want to say anything on the...
Well, just a very quick word about the point about the plutocracy. And if you think back over the last couple of decades, who has the capitalist system worked well for? Like a 4-box grid. It's been fantastic for the poorest people in poor countries. They've massively raised the bar. It's been even better for rich people in poor countries who've made out like bandits as a result of global capitalism. It's been very good for rich people in rich countries, and it's been far less effective for poor people in rich countries. And that is where the Gilets jaunes and the populists and everybody else is coming from. So there is a plutocracy point, and it's who has capitalism not worked well for? It's not to say capitalism as a whole hasn't worked, because it's 3 out of 4 groups have done well.
Yeah, Paul, can you just hold that thought? I want to bring in one of our other audience. Go ahead.
I'm speaking from a sort of strange perspective, since I'm a member of one of those unelected groups, but not one that you've mentioned here. I'm a member of the press, and we're the ones who everybody is most annoyed with.
That's fair enough. I should.
The ones who make a living at being the enemy of the people. I've heard a lot of discussions about challenges, but the questions I have basically come down to really 2 questions. First of all, is there a way forward that you see with these challenges, or are we just going to sit there and say, okay, we've got challenges, now what? Secondly, the UK and the US have always had, since a couple hundred years ago anyway, a pretty good relationship. Do you see any change in the economic relationship now that the UK is moving away from Europe?
Thank you for both of those. Where should we start? And Anne-Marie, given you so kind as to offer us some solutions in the beginning, do you want to expand on them?
I'll give
a bit.
You,
I will offer you my own thoughts as well. No.
And I will leave it to our British colleagues to talk about the Britain moving away from Europe. So there are definitely solutions. I mean, I actually do think that this is the equivalent of the early part of the 20th century. The worse it gets, or maybe the last part of the 19th century, better, before, and you look at the scale of change we made from 1900 to 1920, and it's staggering. We overhauled our political system, we overhauled our economic system, we put in places the beginnings of income tax, social insurance, work and health and labor regulations. The place you start is ranked choice voting across all the states. We need a multi-party democracy. Ranked choice voting just means instead of first past the post, winner take all, it's a way of achieving proportional representation without a constitutional amendment. You don't need anything other than each state to adopt that way of electing its officials, as Maine has done. But at one stroke, you support moderates. You give everybody the incentive to appeal not just to their base out here, but to the middle. And you could also have a third party without being a spoiler. So I really think we need to repair our democracy, and we can do it. And you can actually see it starting to happen in states and cities.
Paul, do you want to come in on that?
I think that's exactly right for America, and I would add only to it the court being more robust on gerrymandering. What I was going to say earlier is I think that the cooperative phase of American politics, and especially in the Senate, which lasted so long and served the country and the world so well, technically I'm not actually sure that was a stable equilibrium, even though it was persistent. I think the uncooperative phase that we're in now is actually potentially a stable equilibrium, and the reason for that is because it embeds itself through gerrymandering of districts, which is and a whole load of other things that I won't bore you with. And the only way of breaking through this is, rather like Italy, but more importantly because it's here, I think the fundamental problems in the United States are rooted in the way that the Constitution is operating today, most obviously through elections. And so I completely agree with Anne-Marie about that. I think in Britain, I think that one of the big things that happened when I was becoming an adult was a shift in power from the provinces to London. So I think the problem, and I think one of the great projects in the UK should somehow be, how do we shift power back and so that parts of the elite, I prefer to think of today's thing as an elite rather than an establishment, so that they kind of want to go and run parts of the country. We've always, for 1,000 years, we've been a capital-centric country, but more so over the past 20 years than ever previously. There was a moment, because I was a central banker, I prefer not to comment on party politics. There was a moment when I thought, my God, every political party leader is metropolitan. This is not good. And so some of the regional things that are happening in the UK, I think, are a really important slow motion solution. In terms of economic relations, Europe will eventually end up in a system of concentric circles. Distance still matters in trade and economics. It may not matter so much in 50 years' time, but it still matters a lot. I think that the UK's economic and financial relations with the United States will not change fundamentally, and eventually over a period of some years, similarly with Europe. But if you ask me to put a timetable on that, I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah. John, do you want to add a few things? And I'm going to give you my view as well.
To come in on that, I mean, very, very briefly, I 100% agree with Paul about the need to devolve power out from the capital in the UK. And you know, when I was in government, we worked quite hard at that. And you can see the fruits of that. And this is the practical examples I was talking to, where we go out as a big investment manager, and we go to a city like Leeds, which is 450,000 people roughly, and plenty of opportunities. And because the land price is much cheaper than London, the economics of investment is much more sensible. And it's very easy to put, £650 million into 5 or 6 projects there, and the whole economy picks up, which solves another problem, which is the massive disconnect between, a very productive, fast-growth capital city and a lot of laggard cities who've fallen way behind over decades outside. But the other point, just to come back to you about what are the opportunities coming out of these challenges? Well, just to pick one of them, which is the aging society. People aging means typically people saving more money for longer in their pension schemes. It also means a greater desire to de-risk on the part of companies who own pension schemes, to de-risk their exposure to longevity. And these, in turn, create these big pools of capital. And the trick is to sensibly and productively deploy those pools of capital into long-term investments to improve the lot of the citizen in those places where they live. So I think it does create opportunities. So every problem has a flip side, and it creates the chance, at least, for a solution.
And as I said, I'll give you my own views, which I'm glad we've ended up on that point about opportunities. But I think, if you want gloom these days, you talk about politics or economics. If you want optimism, you go and talk to people in technology or medicine, or in involved in the longevity business, if I can put it that way, or in tech. And the sense of excitement to be alive is in that area, not so much in the wrangling that we're talking about at the moment. And the opportunities, it seems to me, very much are there, and many of the financial problems we're talking about could be solved by people working a bit longer. The Brits are being, I feel, a bit coy in talking about Brexit here and the relations with the US. So I don't want to embarrass the ambassador in any way. So I will simply give you my view that the economic relations with the US are going to have to be determined in the first part by whatever deal the UK does with the European Union, which remains unclear at this point. And I'm sure there will be, obviously, some thrashed out economic and trading relationship with the US that follows that. But it's not one in which the UK at the moment is in a terribly strong position to negotiate. But we'll have to see. This is playing out almost day by day. No one has asked the direct question of what is going to happen next. Let's see if we can squeeze in. We're going to come very soon to drinks next door, and I don't want to stop people from that conversation. But are there 1 or 2 questions more that people want to? Right, there's one here, and are there any more? Then I'll take 2 at once. Right, and one here. Go ahead.
John Bellinger. I'm going to ask a question at least 2 of you know is completely out of my area, so nothing to do with international, so it's maybe not a good question, but infrastructure, domestic infrastructure. Those of you who know history much better than I do, those days when the great men and women could really sit down and think to build Central Park or great highway systems in the United States. And we're unable to do that anymore at all. We can't even agree on a road. One thing people thought in this country, well, at least Republicans and Democrats could agree on a highway bill, and that hasn't happened. It's remarkable that a country like the United States has no high-speed rail. An enormous country, we have the Sicela that sort of chugs along on, at least on a good day, at 100 miles an hour.
And you can't walk on it while it does.
Roads are falling apart. So my question for you, and I don't know enough, Paul and John, about what's going on in the UK, but we know our country really is falling apart in terms of infrastructure. Part of that is the two sides just can't agree. And is there, are we past the days where we will be able to have big infrastructure projects that will rebuild our country?
Great question, thank you. And embedded in that is one of the weaknesses of democracy. China's building plenty of roads. And let's take a second one at the same time.
Okay, great. So Wanda Pierce from George Washington University and NDP Analytics. So my question is about the idea of this positive, constructive collaboration that you mentioned from a business standpoint. And I know that we've perhaps seen successes at the municipal or the regional level, but what that also has created, if you think about innovative technology that's going to be the future of our economies, is that you then have a very burdensome patchwork of regulations. And I was just wondering if, Mr. Godfrey, or any of you have any advice in terms of solutions of, if we can make something happen at, local level, but that's different in California as Virginia. Do you have any advice of how we can bring that up, at least here in the United States, at the federal level, to see changes happen, to help incubate and develop these types of technologies?
Really interesting pair of questions which go very well together. The costs of federalism as well as democracy. Let's start from this end, John, and then we'll work down the panel.
Okay. Well, yes, they are two connected questions. And if to John's question, if I was a man arriving from Mars on planet Earth, and I landed first in the US, and then in somewhere in what we used to call the developing world in Asia, I know which one I would think was more advanced based on the infrastructure that I discovered.
Yeah.
And it's not the answer that anybody wants to hear. The US is a sort of world leader in underinvestment in infrastructure. And we're not far behind in the UK, so I'm not being smug about it. But
there is a high-speed rail line that is not getting built.
That's not yet built. And there's part of the challenge is that politicians, when they think about infrastructure, quite often like to think about these huge marquee grand projets sort of things, and the French are good at that. We in the UK think about HS2, which is the high-speed rail line from London to Manchester, eventually to Manchester, and so on. And it's much less glamorous thinking about the small local things that you can do that enable your workforce to get to work 20 minutes faster in the morning and therefore to be more productive, when they get there. And so this is a real crucial thing about localism. And we find this just with our employees that shaving 10 minutes off the journey time from London to Birmingham, which is about 120 miles, matters far, and we're employers in both centres. This matters far less to us than making the infrastructure around Birmingham a bit better, so that our guys and women there can get to work faster. So you've got to be local. You've got to do these small things. The point I think about constructive collaboration, as Bonnie's point really is, there is some very interesting history of this in the US, including around things like DARPA and how defense technology has created the whole of Silicon Valley, essentially. If you look back far enough, these smart things are picked up by great entrepreneurs off the back of research that was initially government funded, or at least done in universities, and then commercialized. We need to do more of that here. We need to do more of that in the UK as well. A good example, and again, this is one of our own ones, is between ourselves as a company, the City Council in Newcastle, and the University of Newcastle. And this is a specific collaboration to say, and this is, I'll get to your regulatory point in a second, but this is specifically about how do we make Newcastle a centre of excellence for understanding how we look after old people. So it's going to be the kind of exciting work around gerontology and care and all of this. We use pension fund money to fund and invest in the university's buildings and the real estate that happens there. We may well do some stuff with data alongside that. The council, therefore, give us permission to build some more housing around the site and so on. And this whole sort of slightly run-down city starts to achieve some kind of resurgence and get a reputation for a specific thing. But you have to, if you do it differently in every city, and if you do forward-looking, future-facing things, then you are ahead of the curve on the regulation, and you should have a chance to influence that regulation. So I think there's tons of opportunity in that sphere.
Yeah, thanks. Anne-Marie?
So I will just agree on the importance of local infrastructure in many ways, and in part also because even in very red states, it is easier to get a tax increase. I'm thinking of Kansas, or Dodge City actually, where they passed a 1% sales tax increase for investment in civic improvement in a state that would never support something at the federal level. So I do think it's important, it can be done. But I will also say I spend my life on Amtrak, which is to say I live in Princeton still, and that is to say I spend my life in despair. I really do. And I'm not on the Acela, although the Acela is pretty bad. I'm on the regional, which stops when it's cold. Not when it's snowing, but when it's cold. And I can't decide, and there's a point here, I can't decide whether I'm more upset that the train doesn't work or that my fellow Americans accept it. Because I am sitting there in fury that we are the richest country in the world and we can't pass a decent train system. And I will say, although I think the local point is very right, the psychological toll of driving on rutted roads and not having buses or trains that work or airports. San Francisco looks great, but most of our airports, our regional airports look terrific. Our national airports, Dulles, anyone? You know, it takes a toll. There's a psychological sense that we are a declining power. There's a reason the Chinese build these beautiful airports or the French do these great projects, because it makes people feel that they are in a country that is capable of doing such things. So I hope we find a balance. And the last thing I'll say is we all pray that we will be, the United States will be like Africa with the cell phone and the landlines, that we will in fact invent the flying car and then we won't need any of these, but I'm not holding my breath.
That rings a lot of bells with a lot of people of just how old, quote my teenage daughter, New York looks these days. Paul.
So I think you're completely right about the infrastructure. As you'll know, there are lots of theories about why productivity growth is low. There's one associated with Ken Rogoff, one with Gordon, one with Larry Summers, and actually the public policy response could have been infrastructure expenditure. Needn't have been debt finance, could have been, Marty Feldstein argued for tax financed, budget balanced infrastructure. Huge opportunity wasted. The point of saying that is, so this, I think, goes back to the exchange that Anne-Marie were having. This is something to do with politics. So why isn't the system such that senators and governors are incentivized to say, vote for me, I'll give you a train that works? Because it can still work. You think of the Big Dig in Boston, many of the people in the room will know. But Boston, the Big Dig in Boston absolutely transformed that city and has helped Boston. I mean, of course, it's got, you know, loads of great universities which help as well. But the Big Dig really helped transform Boston. So I think you have to fix politics, actually, and not day-to-day politics, but the kind of underlying rules of the game of politics to address some of these massive macroeconomic problems. On regulation, I would say two things, and the sense of my answer is the same. It's not about everyday things. It's, first of all, I think political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic have to do something about the apparent aversion to risk of the public, and I deliberately said apparent, because the reflex response of politicians in democratic countries almost, whenever anything goes wrong, is we'll have a review, we'll introduce a law, we'll commission a regulatory agency to regulate more, and of course this is a burden. And here, the processes of regulatory change may be out of whack for good reasons that have overshot. So Congress passes vague laws. It says to regulatory agencies, go and do X. They weren't elected, and so administrative law says you must go through thorough notice and comment lawmaking. When you want to, if you change your mind and you want to change the regulation, you have to go through notice and comment lawmaking. A huge thing now is the Trump administration wants to deregulate a bit. Actually, the world is full of public law scholars saying, but you hold on, you can't just rip up the rule, and we hate what you want to do. You've got to go through a proper notice and comment lawmaking. That sounds good, but it's if we put so much friction, process about getting anything done, it imagines that we're just better than we are. I mean, you know, my tribe gets things wrong. The ability to experiment and say, oh God, we could have done that better, and rip it up a bit or change it a bit. If you make it impossible to change the regulatory universe, you make public policy much, much harder. And frankly, I think economists should take on public lawyers a bit on that. And I think anyone that's interested in deregulation should embrace that. But even people on the other side of politics who like regulation should embrace that as well, because you get less good regulation if you can't try things out.
Well, that ends on a note of almost optimism. There's been a fascinating discussion. I mean, we've had a surprising degree of consensus and similarities across our countries. Though I was thinking during a lot of this debate about just how some of the differences come out. One Italian official was saying to me last week, looking at the United States and the drama going on at the moment, they don't need a border wall, we do, though. The question, a serious question of whether the European Union can survive without some kind of external barrier is one we will have to leave for another question. We've tackled at least some of these enormous questions within our subject. Thank you very much for very good questions from you, from our panel. Thank you very much, the Ambassador, and all your colleagues. And we will let you know when the Global Thinkers series continues, which is going to be very, very soon. And meanwhile, I hope you look at the Institute for Government website, where we run many events a week on these kind of questions, and delighted to take your thoughts, correspondence, and indeed your watching of these. So thank you all very much indeed, and thank you to the panel. And do come now next door for a drink.